Well, hello and welcome everyone. I'm Carter McNabb. I'm a partner with GRA Supply Chain. And today is the next installment in our COVID supply chain navigation series, where we explore the implications of COVID on supply chains, what it meant, how supply chains are impacted, and more importantly now, what does it mean moving forward? And we've got a couple of videos already up on YouTube on our channel. First was a broader webinar on the overall implications of COVID. There was also a webinar summary that's available for those of you that want the Cliff's Notes and don't want to watch the whole webinar. And now we're really exploring implications for specific industries. So how are specific industries impacted and what does it mean for those industries moving forward? And today I'm joined by James Allt-Graham, who's also a partner at GRA, and Shanaka Jayasinghe, who's a director at GRA, to talk about health. So in terms of the health industry, James, what did you see in terms of primary care at hospital networks?
Yeah, thanks, Carter. Yeah, it's been fascinating the last 8 weeks, working really closely with the hospital network in response to the COVID situation. And there's a number of things that really stand out. And the first is obviously that a lot of the networks have been designed for business as usual, and this is just not business as usual. And so when you look at things like the physical supply chain, even basics, like the amount of storage and secure storage that's available, the quantity of stock obviously needing to move, so all the protective equipment is of a scale that's totally different to BAU. And so a lot of the challenge that we've been working through with those hospitals is how do we scale those supply chains to be able to support, the absolutely critical core operations. How do we do that in a way that enables visibility? So obviously understanding, especially where we've got very scarce supplies of some materials, where they are, and so they can be moved through that network has been a challenge. And then, really focusing as well on the supplier side in terms of, being quite creative in terms of where we've got supply shortages, who else can create or manufacture some of those items for us. So it's been a really interesting and challenging situation. And as a supply chain professional, it's been incredible to be working with the doctors and the nurses on the front line to help them achieve what they need to. I think there's a whole range of sort of learnings that have come out of this, and I think there'll be obviously detailed reviews at the end of it in terms of the way that the supply chain needs to be considered going forward. But a couple of things really stood out. I mean, the first is that where you have processes that are inconsistent across networks, is really hard to scale those in a consistent way. And so that's been one of the challenges across the different hospital networks. The technology that underpins a lot of the supply chains is great for BAU, but it doesn't provide that end-to-end visibility that we look for in a supply chain sense. And when we think about a supply chain control tower, being able to see what is where, that's crucial. And some of those technologies, aren't in place. And so, really needing to achieve that's going to be important. And then I think that balance between efficient supply chain and a resilient supply chain, given that these shocks may occur again in the future, some real thinking about how those should be designed and what's the best way to do it. And as some people would be aware, we do a lot of work with defence, and so there's some different thinking in those models around what level of safety stock, for example, do you keep, where is it held in relation to the end consumer or the end user. So some of those concepts I think are going to be really interesting. But the great news is that through this, there wasn't, because of the PPE gear, any impact on the ability for the doctors and nurses to deliver their core services. So the supply chains did respond, lots of a scramble, but at the end of the day, with the flattening of the curve, it's been a good result. But a great now opportunity to say, okay, well, if this happened again and perhaps we weren't as fortunate, what would we need to do differently and what can we learn from it?
Okay. Thanks, James. Great answer. So what I was hearing in that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that to some extent there were almost kind of disparate micro supply chains that were in place, that were operating under a business as usual model. And when there was a kind of a peak demand surge that hit, and a need to sort of allocate and manage the resources across the supply chain network, the need for greater visibility, some standard processes that were scalable, and some technology to help us make some trade-off decisions from that kind of control tower perspective were really important.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Carter. And coming out of an environment where hospitals run quite differently within a hospital, the wards all run quite differently, and that's difficult to scale in this sort of an environment. So definitely some learnings in there.
Great. Thanks so much, James. I'm sensing Shanaka's got something to contribute. So Shanaka, in-home services and aged care, what was the landscape sort of pre-COVID, and what have you seen since?
Yeah, thanks, Carter. It's really interesting, particularly the backdrop pre-COVID. Aged care was going through a significant step change, and there was a few triggers to that. So there was a Four Corners report, which was quite damning of the aged care sector, and that sparked a lot of rallying around change in the sector. There was also a Royal Commission that's come out with an interim report, and that was quite scathing of some of the management in the space, and again rallied around a change. And then I guess before all of this, there was significant growth, and there still is significant growth in the aged care space. So if we couple that growth with a government push towards in-home services care rather than facilities care, this was the setting pre-COVID. So you can imagine post-COVID, they're adding more challenges into that equation. So I guess with the COVID situation now, there's obviously questions around balancing visitations and making sure that we don't trigger a health crisis or continue to accelerate a health crisis in any of the aged care facilities. But there's also an increase, as James mentioned, demands for PPE, making sure the workforce are looked after and properly safe and secure. So that's part of it. The other part with aged care in particular is this need for transparency and visibility in the supply chain with the workforce. So it's a bit different to...
Can I just jump in? I just, for those watching that might not have as clear a picture on this, is what is the supply chain in aged care services? What are the demands and supplies that we're trying to manage?
Yeah, it's a great question, Carter. So we look at the supply chain in aged care as a service chain. So if you can imagine, a traditional supply chain would be the distribution and flow of goods across the network. With the aged care space, it's really around the people. So there's obviously different services that are required, whether that be domestic assistance, personal care, allied health, nursing, etc. It's all about making sure that we get the right people in the right place at the right time. And you can imagine with the push towards in-home care, there is an increased logistical challenge with that. So the supply chain requirement becomes greater when you start to look at different geographies, a workforce pool that might be available in one, but may not necessarily be available in another. How do you look to balance that? And it really takes into account a lot of the principles from sectors such as aviation, which rely heavily on making sure a tech crew, a flight crew and a cabin crew sort of come together in the one space at the one time, and making sure that system hums. It's very similar to that space.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that. And what do you see moving forward for, I guess, services supply chains kind of post-COVID? What are do you have like a kind of the top two or three key lessons?
Yeah, I think it takes us back to where we were pre-COVID. So there's obviously significant growth in the space. And in addition to that, a move towards in-home care. With that comes a greater logistical challenge. So the ability to forecast your workforce requirements across the services that you're offering is going to be critical. And then how do you schedule that in an optimal way to reduce things like kilometers, overtime, etc. So I think that's going to be the key focus. Where we've seen the challenges to date over the last, I'd say, 3 to 5 years has been providers going after technology solutions without the appropriate level of maturity in the organization itself. So I think the real opportunity here is about capability within the provider space. So like we've seen with FMCG and how the maturity of the workforce has evolved from a supply chain perspective over the last 10, 20 years, we'd see that as a real enabler to some of those technology solutions going forward to support forecasting, rostering, etc.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Shanaka. I'll just quickly talk for those that are involved in, say, pharmaceuticals, please don't feel left out. I guess at some level, the pharmaceutical supply chain probably looks a little bit more like a traditional commercial business supply chain in terms of business worked with. So we've talked about hospital groups and services supply chains. But the pharmaceutical supply chains, again, very much like a commercial supply chain. We're dealing with the flow of goods. I think probably one of the best analogies for what's required in that industry is really looking at what happened with Blackmores in the Pan Pharmaceutical recall in 2003. And I guess the headline on that story was that Blackmores is very well set up with a very strong, very well disciplined and structured sales and operations planning process. So that's for those that don't know what sales and operations planning is, it is a formalized, structured process that helps make demand and supply trade-offs based on service and cost trade-offs, and provides, I guess, enough clarity at an organizational level to understand who makes the decisions, what the decisions points are, and how information is shared across the supply chain. So when the Pan Pharmaceutical recall hit in 2003, they were able to move very quickly to both get in touch with the market and the supply base, and to start working through an allocation process, a fair share process, and just stayed ahead of the curve in terms of the way the landscape was changing. They were able to kind of move more quickly than the landscape itself, and as such, were able to turn that into an opportunity. And the long and short of that is, following the crisis, their market share increased 30% and was retained following the crisis. And we've seen some other research around that suggests that businesses that are more resilient post-crisis, it's not a short-term blip, but tend to, I guess, change their standing in the market. So again, this piece around the control tower, good scenario planning, good integrated bottom-up data and information, and strong teams that have some good structure around that to make decisions and understand what the possibilities and options are and kind of navigate that will be the ones that succeed. So again, scenario planning and resilience being key things across all industries as we're seeing them. So I'm going to ask you guys again, like live television, what are your top 2 recommendations or kind of closing thoughts for the various industries you've been working in? So what are your top 2 or 3, James?
I think there's a real decision point around the level of centralization that we look for within our health network. And, that makes a lot of sense, but there's going to need to be a lot of work then done on standardizing the processes and procedures and putting in the technology. And, by way of example, I guess Coles and Woolies have, gone down to store level planning with planograms and, supplying against those individual store demands. That's been a journey that's taken, quite a long time for them to achieve that. Health will need to potentially achieve that quite rapidly, given the risk exposure. So that's going to be one, I think, real consideration. I think the other obvious one is supply. As Australia, as the rest of the world, has been caught with shortages. How do we mitigate that risk going forward? And it's not just about local manufacturing. It's also been the raw materials, of course, required for a lot of these products. So how do we diversify that risk exposure and mitigate it? That's going to add complexity and cost, and so that's going to be another sort of set of decisions that'll need to be made. So I think those are a couple of quite big issues that'll need to be addressed as we go forward.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Shanaka, what about you?
I think the top tips in the aged care space in home services are around people and technology, and I'll frame that up by saying making sure that before we go or embark on a technology transformation program in the supply chain space, being sure that the policies, the customer value proposition, the employee value proposition is well understood, and it's well understood also how that's operationalized and translated into a series of rules that then drives scheduling, rostering, forecasting, etc. So I think working through the process and making sure that that is a well-defined process that works for the organization and integrates into the other operating processes in the organization. And then from there, taking that business requirement set to then go after the technology pathway. I think that's the key tip for this organization, learning from some lessons of the past.
Right. Thanks so much, my friends. So Shanaka and James, much appreciated. I know you're both very busy, so thanks for making the time today. And for those watching, thanks so much for your time. And we hope you have enjoyed this spotlight on the health industry in terms of navigating COVID in supply chains post and moving forward. So it's the GRA team signing off.
Thanks, Carter.
Thanks.